listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello, you're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is the podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, Rodri Davis, and this week is the 13th in our partnership series with the European Research Network on Philanthropy, or ERNOP, where I talk to academics whose work has been featured in the latest edition of ERNOP's Research Notes series, where they produce practitioner-focused versions of sort of summaries of academic research that's been going on about philanthropy, civil society and volunteering all around Europe. And this time I was joined by, well, first of all, Lauren Dula from Binghamton University, State University of New York in the States, and Laurie Paarlberg, who is from Indiana University, the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy there. And it's a paper that they co-authored with Emoleo Adeyeri, and it's all about power and foundations. So the paper is titled Philanthropic Foundations and the Exercise of Power, an integrative literature review of the many faces of power. Not necessarily easy title to read out, but a really interesting paper and sort of fascinating conversation with Lauren and Laurie about that. Next up, I spoke to Marius van Dijke about a paper that he wrote with Gijs van Houwelingen, and that's called Cognitive Abstraction Increases Prosociality when Loyalty is Valued Lowly, but Decreases Prosociality when Loyalty is Valued Highly. So very much tells you what to expect from that paper, the title, although Marius will obviously explain what some of those terms mean and what the findings are when we come to hear from him. And I should say that Marius is from the Rotterdam School of Management. And then last but not least, I spoke to Oto Potluka about a paper that he co-authored with Lenka Svecova, Eva Blahova Natasa Diatkova, and apologies to any of them if I have butchered your names. I didn't have the opportunity to ask you in person how to pronounce them, so I have done my best. And that paper was titled Do Formal and Informal Volunteering Compete for Engaged Individuals? And Oto is based at the University of Chemistry and Technology, Prague, in Czechia, and that's at the Department of Economics and Management. So we'll hear from Oto about that in a bit. Well, without further ado, let's get into the conversations. As I say, we'll hear from all four academics, both Lauren and Laurie together, and then from Marius and from Oto about their papers. And then I will be back at the end for the usual bit of housekeeping. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Laurie Paarlberg and Lauren Dula. Hi to both of you.
Hello. Hello, Rodri.
Hello. Well, great to have you on the podcast. So this is one of our ERNOP episodes. So we're here to talk about a paper that you have featured in the latest release of ERNOP Research Notes. And the paper in question is titled Philanthropic Foundations and the Exercise of Power, an integrative literature review of the many faces of power. So obviously, to do with foundations and to do with power. So fascinating topics, but maybe the best place to start, if you could tell us all a bit about what the research is about, how it came about, and what some of the key findings are. So, Laurie.
Yeah. So, Rodri, this paper began in 2021. Our research team was inspired by a network of community foundation leaders who were grappling with a really critical question. What role do community foundations play in addressing systemic racism and in perpetuating this? And at its core, they recognize this as a fundamentally an issue of power. So they posed to us what seemed like to us as a straightforward question. How do we understand power and foundations? But as we began to investigate, we discovered just how vast and fragmented the academic literature on this topic truly was. It was scattered across disciplines, fields, making it difficult to draw coherent conclusions. So we turned to an existing power framework in organizational studies developed by Fleming and Spicer. It allowed us to integrate the academic literature, looking at sites and faces of power, 16 distinct types of power. And as Lauren's going to discuss, we reviewed more than 200 articles with this multidimensional framework, and it highlighted the complexity of power relationships and has implications for both scholarship and practice. So I'm going to turn it over to Lauren now.
I love that, Laurie. So what I would say is out of these 200 plus articles, the faces of power are interesting because they start with locations. The idea of power happening within an organization through the foundation itself, being used on other grantees or other nonprofit organizations, power acting over through regulatory agencies on foundations, and also societal impact on foundations and the activities that they take. And then within this, we broke it down with these phases of the idea of dominance, manipulation, coercion, and subjectification. So we were able to kind of map out all these articles within each of these categories in some way. Sometimes, they fell in within more than one category in terms of how they were discussed. What was really interesting to see is the majority of articles really talked about how foundations dominate other organizations through kind of developing this hegemony of ideas and agenda setting and moving discussion of other organizations of grantees toward their own interests, toward things that they were interested in focusing on. I could honestly say over 60% of articles focused on that type of power relationship. What we were really interested in also seeing are some of the missing elements. We have concepts of regulatory agencies working to influence foundations to keep back some of their power, right? To prevent them from having too much influence over society. But then we also see them working with government agencies in kind of interorganizational, networks. And one of the things we propose is actually more of a fifth area of power that just isn't discussed in the literature as much, this concept of power with. So organizations, foundations, working through networks, and also working with the grantees themselves to, enact policies, push programming, set agendas, and do this type of work together. So that was an area that we really found was not discussed. We wouldn't say it was totally lacking. We found it because we were seeing more pop up in some articles. It just wasn't there as much or focused on as much. So definitely an area that we're interested in kind of pursuing further, this idea of power with. And it's these ideas and concepts of power, it sounds so pejorative that foundations are, doing these awful things and trying to control what, nonprofits are doing, or, creating these networks of social identity. It doesn't have to be a negative thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be looked at as a problem, but it should be something we're aware of. And that foundation should be aware of their own influence when we look at some of these relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to come back to that idea in a minute about kind of what people working, practitioners in the sector can take from some of this in terms of making their own thinking on the question of power more fine-grained. I think one other thing I wanted to ask is in terms of the the actual literature review itself, I think it's really interesting to see that you've kind of read across a wide range of sources, because, one of the challenges, it seems to me, is there isn't necessarily, you don't just go to the foundations section of your bookshelf or, to the journal that's about foundations, because it doesn't work like that. So where did you find the kind of discussions of power and foundations were largely situated? What kinds of literature were you drawing on?
So really, a bulk of the articles kind of came from interdisciplinary journals. So it would be like agriculture and sociology. These combinations, these where it brought in elements of environmentalism and sociology, or environmental and economics. So it was very interesting to kind of see that. International studies was another area that was pretty prominent, which is interesting because most of the geographic context of all of the articles focused on North America. Over about 67% of articles were focused on North American foundations. But we were finding, still the second most in international studies journals. So I think there was that dynamic of looking at how these North American large foundations might be influencing other areas around the world. Sociology was huge. So though there was a lot of interdisciplinary areas, I mean, we could talk about a dozen different areas and journal types that we pulled from.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I would ask you, you mentioned before in terms of the faces of power framework that you used, that there's a few different dimensions to that, but one of them is in terms of the location. So this idea that you can have power in or through, over and against, and you suggest a fifth one. In terms of the existing literature, do you think that a lot of the focus has been skewed towards thinking of the power that's exerted through foundations? And actually, do you have any sense that that is shifting or needs to shift, and that actually in the world we live in now, the idea of power over foundations, perhaps by the government or by regulators, as you said, or against foundations by social movements or grassroots organisers, are increasingly important?
Definitely. Laurie, did you want to talk to any of that?
Sure. I think, Roger, that's a really interesting question, because I think that we were surprised by the dominance of the concept of power through. There's very little on how decisions are made in foundations. So power in, which is a fascinating area that needs to be explored further. But increasingly, I think the concept of social movements, whether we're going to talk about effective altruism or the big tech movement and the influence that that has had on foundations, clearly is worthy of additional study.
I really think there's something still fascinating, as you say, the decision-making within foundations about the role of the people who lead foundations and, I guess, work within them, the sort of philanthropoids, and the effect that they have on shaping the distribution of resources that might not necessarily be theirs. So I think it's a really interesting area. I guess the other thing I just wanted to ask, a sort of bigger picture question about power. Do you, in the literature, is there a sense that people are viewing foundations largely as reflections of existing power dynamics within society? So to some extent, they're kind of symptomatic of something that's already there? Or is it that actually foundations are tools for shaping and wielding power, so they actually kind of determine where power sits?
I would say both. You see both coming up in the literature. You definitely see the influence of, movements, society changing. I mean, there was a lot of literature on the civil rights movement, and how foundations were kind of pushing, for certain democratic efforts through the civil rights movement, but then also that pressure over foundations to not overstep their roles as foundations, to not get too involved, to move toward a more mainstream take on how to push civil rights in the United States. So you would see these things happening kind of simultaneously, where they're trying to set the agenda, but then also being influenced by outside, agencies, the government, popular understandings of things to perhaps change their direction. It actually influenced how they approach their programming.
And Laurie, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to add, Lauren, great job. But just to add to that, the very recognition that foundations are creatures of capitalism and capitalist systems, right? That was inherent in the literature.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I just wondered, obviously the focus of this research note series is about links between academics and practitioners. What kind of insights you think this paper can offer for practitioners in particular?
I think I mentioned, touched on it really briefly a moment ago. This kind of positionality that foundations have, that individuals working in that field, understanding the roles their foundations play, having that self-reflection of exactly what kind of power we're seeing, and understanding that movement of power with, that is something that is, a growing concern. And we even see that in practice, right? More foundations looking to hear what their grantees have to say about their programming, wanting to engage in those conversations rather than just dictate. While there was, mentions of that in the literature, it was a gap. It was an area that still needs to be looked at. But it's definitely happening, and it's also probably something that, can be looked at as another way to approach power for foundations, another way to approach their grantees. Laurie?
Sure, Lauren, I agree with you on that, on the practical implications for how we manage grants. I would also say that an understudied question remains the role of foundations in the policy process, and having a better understanding of how networks of foundations, whether they're mainline liberal or conservative foundations, are engaging in networks both to shape public policy and societal attitudes. And I think that policy question has important implications for how we regulate and think about foundations in the process. So I'm going to take it in a different direction from management to policy.
Yeah. Absolutely. There's all these different dimensions to it, and agreed. And I guess the final question is, obviously, talking to people about the papers in this research note series is always inevitably slightly backward looking, because it's research people have already done, and often that's a sort of few years ago. Just really interested in what you're both working on currently. What's your sort of main focus? Does it follow on from this, or are you kind of looking at other areas around philanthropy at the moment?
Lauren, go for it.
so many papers, so much research that has come out of this approach, just looking at power in terms of also democratic movements. So as Laurie was saying, how is policy kind of influenced by foundations? This power, looking at, current democratic backsliding. And how are foundations responding to that? Are they responding to that? Really understanding the historical influence of a lot of social movements kind of working against efforts by foundations to, enact some of these more active democratic programs, and whether or not, these headlines that are like, can philanthropy save democracy? How accurate is that? What does history actually say about the role of philanthropy in that arena? So those are big questions we're kind of diving into with a wide array of different takes and looking through a few different theoretical lenses.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And Laurie, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that as well.
No, just that the current political movement leaves a lot of opportunities for research on power and philanthropy.
Absolutely. And as you say, all of those topics you talk about there are really important in this current moment. Just remains to say thanks ever so much to both of you for coming on the podcast. It's great to hear about this paper and about the sort of wider research that you've got going on. Wish you all the best for the future.
Thank you for having us.
Much.
Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Marius van Dijke. Hi to you.
Hi.
Well, great to have you on the podcast. We're here to talk about a paper that you've got featured in the latest research notes released by ERNOP. And the paper in question is titled Cognitive Abstraction Increases Prosociality When Loyalty is Valued Lowly, but Decreases Prosociality When Loyalty is Valued Highly, which is a very helpfully explanatory title. But maybe the best place to start is still just to tell everybody listening what the research was all about and what some of the key findings in it were.
Of course, happy to tell, of course, and whenever I'm not clear, just ask me to clarify, of course. So the basic idea of the research is that we want to understand why people donate to good causes, right? That's a really important topic. Now, a lot of prior research has identified what you could call individualized victims as pervasive stimuli in research terms, right? So I'm more willing to help when I see a photograph of an individual little boy being hungry than when I learn about abstract statistics about hunger in the world, right? So we've known that for a long time from prior research, right? So individualized an individualized focus works. Okay, so that we knew now, or at least we thought we knew. Now, there's also a more recent stream of research showing that sometimes cognitive abstraction, being in an abstract mindset, thinking more about why we do things or why I do things rather than the nitty-gritty of how I should do things, right, can also actually make people more prosocially inclined. So, and that's great that these two research streams existed separate from each other. But when you read carefully what they both do, they predict the exact opposite. So that is weird. And it's also not very actionable for practitioners, I guess, if two research streams predict the exact opposite for what one should do. So we thought, okay, how is it possible that they do predict the exact opposite? One. Secondly, is there a means to tell when one of the research streams is right and when the other is right? That would be theoretically very informative, and it would also be useful for practitioners. So that's the basis. What we come up with then is the individual difference factor of loyalty, right? Finding it's important to be loyal towards friends and others. Now, most people think of loyalty as something important, right? When I have a friend and that person is in need, I should help that person. When I have a family member, obviously, who's in need, I should help that person. When my country needs me, for instance, in times of war, it gets a bit more shaky here perhaps, but I would be inclined to help my country. But still, there is quite some clear variation in terms of how important exactly people find loyalty, right? And those who find loyalty really, really, really very important, these are the people who are more geared towards the individualized focusing, right? The photo of the individual hungry boy needing food rather than the abstract statistics. And for those who find loyalty just a little bit less important than average, they might still find it important, but a little bit less than average. These people respond more positively to, you could say, to abstract statistics. Well, there you have it. That's the research.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And I guess one sort of top line question that occurred to me, there's a long standing sort of framing around charitable giving, which is about at times it's about head and at other times it's about heart. So it's sort of about empathy and emotion versus rationality. It feels like this is kind of another aspect of that framing. Is that a kind of accurate way of understanding, one way of looking at this?
I guess, and I would say it's but feel free to disagree, of course. But I would say it's even a little bit more novel, our research, right? It's not about head versus hearts, because if you look at what the individualized victim type of research has done, it has really focused on head and heart. When I see this photograph of an individual little boy being very hungry, it touches my heart. But it also resonates with my head, right? Better than these abstract statistics. So that is quite clear. So what we show is that sometimes abstract statistics can actually resonate with, can in some way touch my heart and resonate with my head. So the difference is it's even bigger than you would seem to suggest.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think that's really interesting. And a couple of other things I wanted to pick up on from reading the paper. So one was, I was curious actually whether the findings suggested that an individual who had a strong bias towards loyalty, for instance, so was sort of heavily on that end of the spectrum, if they are subjected to abstract reasoning, does that actively decrease their prosocial behaviour, or does it just merely not increase it? So is it just ineffective, or does it actually dampen their willingness to give?
Our data is not conclusive on that matter, right? We have suggestive evidence showing that it actively decreases or makes them respond in less positive or more negative ways. But in some studies, it just doesn't affect them, and in some studies, it affects them negatively, so to say. So I can't give you a straightforward answer to that one. But there's some suggestive evidence to say that for these people who really strongly value loyalty, you should certainly not present these people with statistics, because they might really respond very negatively to that.
Yeah, interesting. And potentially an area, I guess, for sort of further research to uncover that. And one thing I wondered actually, I guess, in terms of the practical implications of this, as you said, it clearly does have ramifications for organizations that are trying to get people to donate. I wondered whether individuals generally tend to know themselves whether they value impartiality or loyalty more highly. Is it something that we know about ourselves, or is it something that other people have to kind of work out about us?
That's I have to say, fresh or novel question. I think that all of us tend to think of ourselves as loyal. Most of us, at least, right? The large majority of us would say, when you have children, I'm loyal to my children, and when you have friends, you're loyal to your friends. So the distinction between people is actually more subtle. Some of us are really, really, really very loyal, and others just a little bit less loyal. But all of them still consider themselves loyal, and that's also a clear element of social desirability here, right? We should be loyal. I'm not trying to say anything normative here, but we together believe that we should be loyal.
And I guess that's interesting, because I suppose if there's a socially normative element to thinking that we should demonstrate loyalty, but then in reality, people who are more, who sort of incline more towards utilitarian thinking that might take you away from that, they wouldn't necessarily explicitly say that. It's something, I suppose, that we have to discover. Did you, again, it might not be something that came out in the design of these experiments, but do you have any sense more broadly of what the proportion of people who are likely to respond, who are more likely to value loyalty and more likely to value impartiality are? Because again, I suppose if you're thinking about operationalizing this and you need to segment, is it sort of half and half, or is it actually only a small group of donors that are likely to show this impartiality bias?
Yeah, it's really a good question, again, from a practical perspective. And there's some information in the paper on that, because we do present analysis about the percentages of people who respond positively, right, and the percentages who respond negatively. But you should certainly not think 50-50, right? You should think about 10 or 20% or so, the people that respond really positively, and 10 and even fewer people who respond really negatively. So it's in that area. But on the other hand, so this research doesn't explain everything. Clearly, it doesn't. But prior research also never explained everything, right? Also, if you look at the identifiable victim effect, that's the classic one. It has quite small effect sizes, right? We tend to respond more positively when we see that little hungry boy than towards abstract statistics. but people also still very often respond positively to abstract statistics, right? Because we are well capable of mentally simulating what that must mean. This research presents some tangible means to influence potential donors, if you want to put it that way. But this is not going to change the world for the better in every respect.
Yeah, and I think that sort of corrective, or at least addendum to the identifiable victim effect from this paper is really interesting, because it's sort of often presented as if here's this finding and this applies across the board, but actually what you're saying is it's not as straightforward as that, because in some cases that doesn't apply, or may even actively sort of reduce people's likelihood to give. It's really interesting. I just want to zoom out a moment and just ask you, obviously, the backdrop to this ERNOP research notes series is about trying to make sure there are better links between academia and practice when it comes to philanthropy. What has your experience been through your work of those links? Do you find it easy to engage with practitioners in the field when it comes to trying to find data and ideas for your research? And conversely, when you're trying to disseminate findings, do you find that it's a kind of willing audience?
Well, first of all, for this data, I did not really need, let's say, the field of philanthropy. The studies really ask people, do you want to donate some of the money that you earn with this research to a good cause, right? So that's also the context of the studies. It's also the limitations of the studies. I immediately agree, right? So, although it's a quite common context, right? You ask people to donate some money, and they do it or they don't. It's certainly not the only philanthropic context that matters. So I can't say that I needed the field for this research. On the other hand, when it comes to outreach, well, I have to say that we are talking now. So I guess I guess that's a good thing. You reached out to me, and several others were interested in the topic. So I guess there are people who read this stuff and who want to disseminate it. So in that sense, my experience is very positive.
Yeah, great. And I guess that's, encouraging, because it's the whole point of the research note series and of this podcast, is to try and provide more and more ways where practitioners who might find value from these kinds of insights can get hold of them without necessarily having to go to the academic literature, which is sometimes a bit of a barrier. I just wanted to ask finally, obviously, when people come and talk about their research on the podcast, often because of the nature of academic publishing, it's a few years in the past that they've done that research. So I'm just interested what it is that you're working on now. What's your current area of focus? Is there anything that sort of follows on from this work in particular?
Yeah, to be honest, research on, let's say, philanthropy or donations to me is a little bit of a side project. I am currently involved in one super interesting research project on philanthropy, and that is I work with a PhD student and another full professor as also as an advisor on trying to understand how and why the medium rich actually structure their giving, right? There's a lot of studies, as you may know, on what normal people like you and me, or at least like me, let's not talk about you, but not the not too obviously rich people do with their money, right? We understand a little bit about their motivations and so on, and the barriers. We know quite a lot about the super rich, right? The Bill Gates types of people, and what they do and why they do what they do. But there's a large number of people who actually earn or possess between, let's say, $5 and $50 million. I mean, it's a lot of money, but you're not super rich, and you're clearly not poor. What motivates these people? And I think we show that, and we are beginning to show in this research that these people very often, you could say, donate their professional knowledge and their skills to the process, rather than focusing solely on money. So that is the next step in this research. Don't only focus on psychological motives that the psychological processes involved in the motivation of, let's say, ordinary people, but try to understand these people who sit together on a huge amount of money, and see how we can reach these people better or motivate these people better to donate.
Yeah, really interesting because, as you say, in my experience, there's a real gap in this sort of long tail of philanthropy between the ultra wealthy and what we know about them and everyday giving. And there's this sort of hidden mass of people giving very large amounts at aggregate, but often we don't really understand it very well. So, we're really interested to hear more about that in future. And just remains to say thanks ever so much, Marius, for finding time to come on the podcast. Really interesting to hear about the research and wish you all the best for the future.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me.
Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Oto Potluka. Hi there to you.
Hi.
Hi. Well, great to have you on the podcast. And we're here to talk about a paper that you've got featured in the latest release of ERNOP research notes. And the paper in question is titled "Do Formal and Informal Volunteering Compete for Engaged Individuals?" Which, really interesting and very clear question there. But maybe the best place to start is if you can just tell everyone listening what the research is all about, how it came about, and what some of the key findings are.
So I will start. What was the main idea to research? So there are 2 points. The first is that we had a unique data set from the Central Europe. So countries Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. Those are about 35 years new democracies in the Central Europe. And it is reflected in lower engagement in volunteering. So, for example, in these societies, the trust among people is lower in comparing to West European countries. This unique data set about volunteering was one reason. And the second one, when we looked at the inconclusivity in studies about whether formal and informal volunteering compete or support each other. So with this sample, we decided, let's test it here, because if volunteering is a scarce resource for non-profits or in the society, so if those 2 types of volunteering compete, you can quickly see it on this data set. Then we progressed with the data, and we tested in a model where we checked whether availability of time and wealth in people have influence on formal or informal volunteering, and whether these 2 types of volunteering compete or support each other. And concerning the results or the main findings of our study, so I would say first it's a positive relationship between formal and informal volunteering. It means if people start informal volunteering, because it's much easier, there are no formal rules, you know some friends in need, so you help them and you don't need any training, simply help them. So that might be a start for formal volunteering in the future, because when you start and then you continue. The way can be also opposite. If people volunteer for some organizations, they get some knowledge, some skills, and they can use them even they don't volunteer for an organization. So, for example, in our paper, we showed that there is a potential in aging societies when the population aging comes. Simply, if people are trained by some non-profit organizations, they can help relatives or friends to take care, and if need to call the professionals, so they can take the knowledge from the formal volunteering to informal volunteering. That was the first finding, and the second finding relates to relationship in resources and volunteering. So first, that was relating to time, because if people are busy or they don't have time, they don't have time to volunteer either. And we find out that formal volunteering is more sensitive on availability of time than informal volunteering, but time is less sensitive factor for volunteering comparing to wealth. This is our third finding, that simply having resources and supports engagement in formal volunteering and in informal volunteering and even informal volunteering. And volunteering for example, non-profit organizations is a very supportive factor to volunteer. The opposite way, if people lose well, they stop quickly engage themselves in non-profit organizations, and but they still continue dropping their informal engagement. So these are the three conclusions from this paper, and I'm glad that we could test this model and this information on Central Europe. Because, as I mentioned at the beginning, comparing to Western countries, volunteering is not so common in comparison to Western countries. So it means it shows if people engage, they really want to engage, and simply formal and informal volunteering do not compete each other.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting and good, as you say, to have those findings. I guess in terms of talking about formal versus informal volunteering, we all have an intuitive sense of what that means. But is there anything more to be said about how you apply the distinction in the paper in terms of where the boundary is between what counts as informal or formal, or is it more of a spectrum?
We explicitly ask for the respondents whether they engage in formal. It means for an organization. It can be non-profit organizations or any organization. Important aspect is simply it's organized by an organization. Contrary to informal volunteering, where it's simply beyond the household those respondents live, like it can be wider family, uncles, aunts, cousins, simply not people who live in the same household. It can be for friends or neighbors. And we explicitly ask and define formal and informal volunteering this way. Because we found also some surveys in Central Europe where this question was not clear enough and people were confused. So for that reason, with this knowledge, we thought exactly what we mean by formal and informal volunteering. Simply, are there organizations organizing volunteering? And if not, so we go to informal volunteering.
Yeah, absolutely. And I noticed one of the things that you mentioned a few times in the paper is the importance that trust plays as a factor in determining whether people volunteer. Perhaps you could say a bit more about that. What kind of trust are we talking about? Is it trust between individuals or trust in organizations or institutions? And how big a part does it play?
So actually, we work with both types of trust. And simply in the previous research and the literature, you can find many cases how social capital, of which trust is an important part, improve ability or willingness of people to engage. And simply we use both trust in people, trust in institutions, and if people have trust in these two types of organizations and people, they are willing to help. It really is also strangers if anybody needs help. So people, if they trust, they engage and help. If they don't trust, so they hide themselves at home and they leave it as it is. So trust was important factor to build the social networks, and from the literature you can easily find that networks are very important to build the ties and get the information about the possibility to volunteer and engage to help to other people in both formal and informal way.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I wanted to ask, you noted before that the particular focus of the paper is on Eastern Europe, so Czechia, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia, and that's really interesting in itself. I'm sort of curious about whether that particular context that you note, the fact that these are countries with sort of post-communist legacies where perhaps civil society was weaker for a period of time and is rebuilding. Does that mean that the findings are quite specific to that context, or do you think they can be generalized more broadly, or do you think this is a sort of question that should be tested in other contexts as well?
We simply use these countries as countries where the trust is lower in comparison to other countries. If people don't trust and the volunteering is at lower level than the others, so as a resource, volunteering as a resource, so the organizations have to compete for it, so that there are the specific circumstances where advantages for the research. And I spoke about those countries as a region, but there are differences across these countries. So if you have a look at the international surveys, so you see that the Czechs are behaving differently than the rest of those countries, because the Czechs are more engaged in philanthropy, spending more money, providing more time for volunteering. And at the beginning of 90s, there were not such huge differences, but it developed. And currently, you can see that the Czechs are engaged more than the other nations in Central Europe. So this is a topic for another research. So it was not the case here, but it is. These countries are a specific group, and they, even at the political level, they collaborate together a lot. So during the last few years, it changed as there are tendencies to not to collaborate anymore, or less intense collaboration appeared during last 2-3 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And just sort of zooming out a little bit, I'd be interested in your experience. Obviously, the idea behind these ERNOP research notes is to try and build links between academics and practitioners. In your work, have you found it easy to engage with practitioners, either in terms of doing research or disseminating findings of your research?
So for the practitioners, especially non-profit organizations, so it makes sense. If they train volunteers, the volunteers will not disappear. They will continue their work either in that organizations or by themselves. And in both cases, it makes sense. Simply, if the organizations have their mission, so even if people follow the mission without the organizations, in my perspective, it makes sense for the organizations. And the opposite perspective, if non-profits see people engaged informally, they can gain them for formal volunteering, because they already know what does it mean to help someone else. It takes time, and for practitioners, the reason is so simply, if they ask people, can transform their informal volunteering to formal volunteering. And practitioners in non-profit organizations in these countries, if, for example, when we spoke about time, so they can help them to organize their time. Because sometimes if I hear questions from non-profit organizations, we need volunteers who come regularly, for example, on Thursday afternoon, every Thursday afternoon. But for people in current societies, they need flexibility. It makes problems to non-profit organizations. But on the other side, if they make this flexible volunteering more available for volunteers, it means they need to more organize the time schedules for the volunteers, for more volunteers, but it can work. Simply having looking at the results of our research from the perspective of practitioners in non-profit organizations, they can gain volunteers by helping them with time availability, and if some people are not wealthy enough, like, for example, it costs some fuel commuting to a center to help. So they can provide such services like taking people from various places with a small bus, bringing them to the center and let them help the non-profit organization. So there are ways how to see volunteering through our research from the practical perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just finally, I'd be interested, obviously, when we're talking about these papers, often the research in question has been done a little while ago. I'd just be interested to know what you're currently working on, whether it relates to this or whether you're looking at other areas.
I continue doing research on volunteering. And for example, one of the current papers is actually based on this data set about religion. How religion influences willingness of an actual volunteering in people. Because, as I mentioned, the differences in philanthropic behavior among those countries, on one side, the Czechs, they are the most engaged, but on the other side, only about certain Czechs are religious in comparison to Slovakia or Poland, which is about 75%. And this makes the thing interesting. The secular nation engage more philanthropically than the religious nations.
Yeah, that is really interesting, and kind of counterintuitive. So I'll be really interested to read more about that when it's ready. Just remains to say thanks ever so much, Oto, for finding time to come on the podcast and talk about your work. It's really great to hear about it, and wish you all the best in the future.
Thank you very much for listening me, and I'm looking forward to hear the postcard. And if you are interested in some more research about volunteering, let me know.
Great. Okay, great. Well, my thanks again to Lauren and to Laurie and to Marius and to Oto for finding time to come on the podcast. Really interesting to hear about all of their research. I'll put links in the show notes to places where you can find the papers in question and also the ERNOP research notes that are based on them, and where you can find all of the other ERNOP research notes. And of course, there are now many, many editions of this podcast partnership as well, when you can hear from other authors whose work has been featured in those ERNOP research notes. And I'll put links to where you can find some of those, but they're all there on the website. If you're interested more broadly in philanthropy and civil society, do check out the website at whyphilanthropymatters.com. Loads of articles there, lots of news updates about things that I've been doing, shorter guides to interesting issues in philanthropy and civil society, and obviously all of the back issues of this podcast. So, spend many happy hours there digging in if that takes your fancy. If you want to follow me for shorter updates, you can do that on LinkedIn and also on Blue Sky, where I post semi-regularly on that one and fairly regularly on LinkedIn. If you've got ideas for people that I could talk to on the podcast or topics we could cover when we're not doing these ERNOP Research Note partnerships, do drop me a line. You can find my contact details at the website. Always great to hear from people with suggestions. If you want to get involved in the ERNOP Research Note series, I'll put links in the show notes to places where you can do that. Certainly as a practitioner, if you're interested in participating by producing a research note as part of that series, I'm sure ERNOP would absolutely love to hear from you. Other than that, it just remains to say thanks ever so much for listening. If you like the podcast and you think other people might, please do recommend it to them. Spread the good word. I think that goes a long way. And other than that, I will see you next time. Bye!